Hello, my name is Lily Shapiro. I use she, her pronouns, and I am policy counsel at the Fortune Society's David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask you, our viewers, to spread the word about both sides of the bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at TheFortuneSOC. Today's show is entitled Advancing LGBTQ plus Rights in the Shadow of Mass Incarceration, a Pride Month special. And it's my great honor to introduce two powerful people who are working on these issues in different parts of the country, Mickaela Bradford and Maritza Henriquez. I'll just briefly introduce them and then we'll get into our conversation. Mickaela Bradford, she, is a leading cultural organizer based in Atlanta, Georgia, and the current co-director of policy and programs at the Transgender Law Center, where she co-coordinated the development of the Trans Agenda for Liberation, a living decriminalization policy platform, and supports ongoing national strategy and grassroots organizing. Based in Oakland, California, the TLC is the largest national trans-led organization advocating self-determination for all people. Maritza Henriquez, them, is an equity strategist and healing-centered community educator and organizer. As the trainer and lead organizer of the Legal Aid Society's LGBTQ plus law and policy unit in New York City, Maritza leads strategic community engagement and education efforts across New York to center and empower incarcerated transgender, non-conforming, non-binary, and intersex people through a people-powered and intersectional lens. Maritza is also a co-founding member of the Trans Prisoners' Rights Coalition, a New York statewide coalition of impacted activists, legal service providers, policy experts, and organizers, working toward the common goal of liberation, dignity, safety, and respect for all transgender, non-conforming, non-binary, and intersex people who have been directly impacted by the carceral system. But now let's hear from both of them directly. Hi, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to be with you. And Mickaela, let's start with you. I know you've worked on initiatives around the country, so very much hoping you bring those up wherever it fits in here to our conversation. Tell us a little bit about your current role and work at TLC.
Yeah. Hi, Lily. Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure to get to share the wonderful work that Trans Law Center does. I have the privilege of co-directing a robust department of organizers and policy experts, many of whom are trans folks, many of whom are Black trans folks, working every day to ensure that the community has the resources and information needed to thrive, not just survive. We're an organization that focuses on impact litigation, policy legislation, and direct action on the ground. We also have a legal help desk where folks can receive information on the legal matters that they encounter. We can't, unfortunately, represent everyone. I wish we could. But for those who have requests that are easily manageable, we can figure things out. And then we also have a prison mail program that allows us to know what is going on inside some of these prisons so that we can advocate from the outside.
Thank you so much. And Maritza, can you tell us a bit more about your role and your specific unit at the Legal Aid Society?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. And thank you, Lily, so much for having me here today. So I'm part of the LGBTQ Law and Policy Unit as part of the Legal Aid Society in New York City. We are a small but mighty unit comprised of 3 individuals, our director, a staff attorney, and myself as a trainer and organizer. Internally, we train over 2,200 staff members on LGBTQ plus affirming practices. And we know that these are the service providers that are on the ground all across New York City. And we also train externally multiple providers across the city and state. Our unit is also incredibly active in legislative and policy reform across New York State. Myself and Mick Kincaid, who is the staff attorney of the unit, are co-founding members of the Trans Prisoners' Rights Coalition. Currently, the unit has focused a lot of its energy and resources in the passing of the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act, which when passed would make jails and prisons house trans, gender nonconforming, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, non-binary.
Don't worry.
Non-binary and intersex people where they are safest and ensure they have access to life-saving, gender-affirming medical care and personal items.
Great. Well, both of you are working at so many different levels to get at some of the same issues. It's wonderful to have you both in conversation today. And I just want to refer back to a conversation the three of us had that I felt so lucky to have a few weeks ago. We talked a lot about the meaning of safety in the context of mass incarceration and how there's some cognitive dissonance there when we're talking about safety in that context. And we also talked about trying to reduce the reach and the harms of mass incarceration in multiple different ways, in creative ways and in ways that some folks might find surprising. So Mickaela, I was interested in exploring something with you that some of our viewers might find surprising, which is that TLC, your organization, took a position against hate crimes legislation as a solution to combat anti-trans acts of violence and discrimination. And I was curious, and specifically that's something that doesn't promote safety, hate crimes legislation. So I was curious, how and why did TLC come to that position?
I'm really glad that you asked. There are so many values that TLC leads with. One of them being trust and community, right? So even though it is in the name, Trans Law Center, our legal department follows the guidance and the leadership of organizers and everyday people on the ground who are experiencing the brunt of these attacks and know exactly what they need. So we don't even need to decide for them or come with an already made up strategy. They tell us what they need. And I think that applies even beyond our work into just the community building work, because we deeply believe that our protection of each other lies in each other, right? Not in the state, not in the government, not in police in particular. And we try to lead with a value of challenging ourselves to just imagine more, right? Like what is more possible when we think about a world where we are able to hold each other accountable for harms caused. When we think about a world where everyone has their needs met and they don't have a need to go out and enact violence on anyone or steal resources or whatever it is that they are being criminalized for, because their needs are met. Really, this was a stance that we took to center the root causes of violence and inequality. So that was sort of like the background of like the values that we lead with, right? And then to actually like dig a little deeper into that,
Sure, please do,
we released the project last year. Sorry, did you say something, Lily?
Oh, no, I just said, please do dig a little deeper. Yes.
Thank you, I will. We released the project last year that really took a look at gathering key leaders who are abolitionists working at the intersections of policing, sex work, disability justice, racial justice, and more. And we interviewed them as an advisory board to just learn like what they had encountered in their organizing. And across the board, it was pretty unanimous that all hate crime laws do is call for longer prison sentences. They don't address the systems at the root of anti-trans violence. And they're regularly used to lock up the very communities they claim to protect. They funnel more power and money into policing and prisons, into a very anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-sex worker, ableist, transphobic system. those same systems that many of our ancestors fought so hard against. And so I want to make this, if folks don't understand anything from this, I just want folks to understand that all of these groups of folks, whether your preconceived notion is that they don't have anything in common, they do. And quite frankly, everyone needs to be involved in the work of undoing prisons, policing, a system of punishment, and really embrace a system of community care, embrace a system that funnels resources to the most marginalized folks who have continually missed out. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm blessed to call that city home. And in the rest of the state of Georgia, there are so many disparities that trans folks face, particularly incarcerated trans folks. And that is just because of a historical lack of resources to the South in general. So I really would love for folks to check that out. If you want to go, for folks listening in, to transgenderlawcenter.org/hate-crimes. Check out the video I narrated, check out some of the interviews from key community leaders, and just start to learn about what are ways that we can dream of a better world today.
Thanks, Mickaela. There's so much in there that I would love to explore and wish we had so much more time to do so. But just pulling out some of those threads and trying to bring Maritza back into the conversation. You spoke a lot about speaking with and listening to people who are working on the ground and doing organizing as a way of developing TLC's position on something that seems like an easy fix, right? A bit of a Band-Aid instead of getting at the issues that are driving those actions. And so, Maritza, I was thinking about a little bit about your legislative advocacy, which I'd love for you to talk about, and your outreach, your community building with incarcerated people, and how that has driven the legislative advocacy that your unit is engaged in.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. And thank you so much, Mickaela, for sharing all of that important context as to what feeds into the systems of harm that our communities are faced with every single day. And I love this question of safety within this context, because it really, what does safety mean, especially within the context of my work for an incarcerated person, when we know that prisons and jails are inherently unsafe spaces? And for me, it speaks to the invisibilization of incarcerated people and how that is compounded with the invisibilization of transgender, nonconforming, non-binary, and intersex people. Specifically, even within the context of New York State and city human rights law, for example, refusing to use an individual's requested name, pronoun, or title is illegal. Refusing to allow an individual to use facilities with their self-identified gender is illegal. And yet when it comes to our most vulnerable New Yorkers, who we know are systemically disenfranchised, we know that the Supreme Court is currently organizing to try to make homelessness illegal. We know that there are so many resources that are being cut and being funneled into the carceral system. So we can only do the math to assume that each and every one of us is ultimately expendable if the system sees us as profit ultimately. And so what we're seeing is that human rights law, although effective and in place, is somehow null and void when it comes to our most vulnerable New Yorkers. And so what does it look like on the inside? It's truly horrifying, right? We have, specifically within the context of New York State, at least 80% of incarcerated transgender, nonconforming, non-binary, and intersex people have reported being placed in solitary confinement as a means of protection. And we know that people placed in solitary confinement are not safe, right? We know that it places people in very precarious situations, and it doesn't allow people to then return home as their full selves. And we also know that at least 95% of incarcerated TGNC NBI folks have also within New York State have reported being accosted verbally by corrections officers and other staff of the jails and prisons. And these are the people that are tasked with keeping people safe. So really what our coalition is about centering the voices of those people on the inside and listening to those stats and really empowering people to not just tell their stories, where we constantly pluck people from the inside to tell their stories and give a human element to different policies and legislations. And what we really want is for people is to uplift people as subject matter experts in the field, because they really are the people that we should be listening to and uplifting, and how to create spaces where people are also compensated for their labor, because a lot of us are in these spaces through organizational support. And so a lot of our work is also dedicated toward that.
Right. And it's one thing for you, for me, for Mickaela, for anybody in this work to, we have salaries, right? We are getting paid to talk about these issues. But for people to be lending their brain power and reliving experiences as well, that is work in service of a cause. So Mickaela, Maritza, can you talk a little bit more about the way you engage with people while they're incarcerated? Right. And because I think that would be really helpful for people to understand that the fact that someone's incarcerated doesn't mean they can't be an advocate for causes. They can't, and it doesn't mean they can't work on pushing for policy change on the outside.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for following up with that question. So a lot of the work since I've started with the unit has been in trying to bridge that gap and that communication between our unit and the work that we're doing and the folks that are on the inside. And one thing that's really special about our unit, as opposed to other law and policy units related in the field of trans advocacy, is that we also do impact litigation, and we also have direct relationships with folks on the inside. So I formulated a newsletter, which is now part of the Trans Prisoners' Rights Coalition newsletter. And what this does, it has a lot of educational resources. It has self-healing and mental health resources for people. It has educational resources to help people empower themselves, not only with their experience, but with the historical knowledge to understand that their experience is not their fault necessarily, that people are here because of systemic antecedents and historical antecedents that have enabled their position due to lack of resourcing of certain communities, and also the invisibilization of trans people from our education system. And so it's important to know that trans people have always existed, and it's empowering for folks to know that people are organizing on the outside in their favor. So what we do also is we encourage people to submit their artwork, their poetry, their written testimony. We're also working now to develop some sort of policy guideline so that people can draft their own policies, and we can truly have people on the inside and people who have been released dictate what reform and liberatory practices should actually look like.
Wow. And it also sounds like in doing that, you're bringing in some joy, right? And giving people a platform to share their artwork and talk about wellness, which Mickaela also resonates with so many things you've said, talking about thriving, not just surviving, right? And acknowledging joy. And I really do encourage the viewers to look at the Transgender Law Center's website and various links to, there's so much color and joy there. It's really spectacular. But Mickaela, I know you've also done some work around the safety of incarcerated transgender people in Colorado. Can you speak a little bit about that work and how that organizing was similar or different to what Maritza's talking about?
Yeah, and first off, I just want to say I really, really just have so much respect for Maritza and just the way that you frame this work and bring in the idea that this is not about individual punishment or lack, but this is actually about a collective lack of resources, a collective punishment that we are all experiencing. And I just really think that's really important, because we have a society that tries to say, oh, well, that's your issue and that's their issue, but they're actually deeply connected to each other. So thank you so much for making that. And yeah, if folks don't know, TLC recently had a consent decree from affecting the Colorado Department of Corrections that basically enacted some comprehensive policy changes that also provide gender-affirming healthcare in line with community standards. It established 2 housing units, so an integration unit at a women's prison intended to temporarily house trans women as they transition into the women's general population. And then there was also a voluntary trans unit at a men's prison for trans women who prefer to be housed with other trans women. And this is important, I think, because safety looks different for all of us, right? And at the bottom line, we all deserve the self-determination to choose the care and safety that we need. It should not be up to the state to decide that based on our sex assigned at birth, or perception of our gender identity or gender expression. That should be up to each person, and there should be space. I think one of the ways in which this kind of has been supported is by nearly all, I think, major American medical associations, the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare. Folks agree across the board that this is setting a new standard of care. So I think the GERDS Act is setting a new standard of care. This consent decree is setting a new standard of care for folks in Colorado prisons, and as a model for other states. And I think it also just addresses this long-standing pattern of incarcerated people, particularly trans incarcerated people, being targeted, being really targeted by cruel policies and cruel correctional officers who are operating out of their biases. And we are trying everything that we can to decrease the violence that trans people experience, decrease the barriers they face to receiving care and services that align with their gender identities. And we're going to continue to do this work to build spaces for people in a system that is and has long been unsafe for everyone who is detained. I can't stress enough that we are very much against the prison system as it stands now. Some of us identify as abolitionists. We held a call-in of a number of progressive LGBTQ orgs who had not made a statement when George Floyd was murdered, in support of defunding the police. We held a teach-in, some political education, shared the resources that we knew, and got a lot of organizations to sign on to supporting the work of defunding, however that looks in their different localities. But it's important, I think, on the road to abolition, on the road to replacing systems of punishment with systems of care, we have to make sure that folks who are incarcerated today have an easier time. We can't ignore that. People need resources today, now, yesterday.
And to your points, people were always there, right? Identity, people were, depending on how people chose to identify themselves, what was safe at different points to do that. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is a different type of conversation we're able to have now, but it's not about different people who didn't exist before, right? And speaking of care, I believe that, I think it was Maritza who'd said when we were talking before that no one is safe in prison. So how do we get people safely home so they can live their best lives? So what do you two want advocates and policymakers and other community members do to help prevent specifically transgender people and other non-straight, non-cisgender people from being caught up in the system of mass incarceration in the first place? What should we do? Either one of you, jump right
in. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say I can give you a breather because you had two back-to-back as well. I think it really comes down to what Maritza and I are both saying, is that we have to listen deeply to the stories of struggle, the stories of triumph, the struggles of joy even, right? It's not all about the violence and discrimination that we face, but it's also about where we find joy, right? And how to increase that, how to lift that up as a source of hope that we can one day live in the communities that we desire to live in. For some context, I'm calling from North Carolina right now, where TLC is convening a number of trans caregivers to talk more about what caregivers need. We know that parents are under attack right now for just providing gender affirming care to their children. They are being targeted by departments of child welfare, and providers of gender affirming care are being criminalized. So how do we give them the tools they need to be able to fight this? And also give them hope that they are not struggling alone, but that they are in a long, long tradition and history of resistance. And there are so many other families that are going through similar things. So yeah, I definitely think that if you don't know the stories of incarcerated trans folks, please listen to them. Please uplift those voices. Please take action. It will take a lot of folks having to navigate whether they want to continue to benefit from the privileges they have being on the outside, or if you want to risk it for the betterment of all of us. We will all have to make sacrifices. We will all have to give up some part of our privilege in order to make this work. I do know some healthcare providers who are talking about the ways in which they can put their medical practice on the line in order to get trans people the care that they deserve. And that is the brave action that we need folks taking. No more lip service, because we can't and we are not free until all of us are free.
I think that is an amazing line to end on. Maritza, I would love to turn it back to you, but we're about to be out of time. And as we know, we could keep going on this because there's so much more to talk about. But I want to thank you both for coming on, sharing your wisdom and experience. I thank you, the viewers, for joining us all for this really thought-provoking discussion, which could have just been the first in many. And in the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for tuning into both sides of the bars. If you're interested in learning more about the Fortune Society, please check us out at fortunesociety.org. This is Lily Shapiro, and I appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.